The morning Theresa Walsh's father locked her out of the house with nothing but the clothes on her back and a canvas bag containing 2 dresses, she stood on the porch of their Colfax, California home and felt the world tilt beneath her feet. It was April of 1876, and the spring sun beat down mercilessly as she pounded on the heavy wooden door, begging him to reconsider, to listen, to understand that she had done nothing wrong. But Edwin Walsh was a man whose pride had been wounded, whose reputation in their small mining town mattered more than his own daughter's welfare. And when the neighbor woman had whispered poison in his ear about seeing Theresa speaking too freely with a Chinese railroad worker down by the tracks, his fury had been absolute and unshakable. "You have shamed this family," he had shouted through the door, his voice thick with rage and something that might have been grief. "No daughter of mine carries on with those people. You are no longer welcome under my roof." Theresa's protests that she had merely been asking the man for directions to the mercantile, that there had been nothing improper in their brief conversation, fell on deaf ears. Her father had made his decision, and Edwin Walsh never went back on his word, no matter how cruel or unjust that word might be. Her younger sisters watched from the upstairs window, their faces pale and frightened, but none of them dared to speak in her defense. Her mother had died 3 years earlier from pneumonia, and since then, her father's temper had grown increasingly volatile, his drinking more frequent, his judgment more clouded by the opinions of bitter townspeople who saw threats and scandal in every innocent interaction. By midday, Theresa found herself walking down the dusty main street of Colfax with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The town had grown rapidly over the past decade as the Central Pacific Railroad pushed through the Sierra Nevada foothills, bringing with it a chaotic mix of miners, railroad workers, merchants, and gamblers. It was a place where fortunes could be made or lost in a single night, where violence erupted as quickly as the afternoon thunderstorms that rolled down from the mountains, and where a young woman alone was seen as either a commodity or a problem. She tried first at the boarding house run by Mrs. Henderson, a stern-faced widow who had always been civil to her at church. But when Theresa explained her situation, the woman's expression hardened with disapproval. "I cannot harbor a girl who has been cast out by her own father," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice cold. "What kind of establishment would people think I am running? No, I am sorry, but you must find somewhere else." The same response met her at the hotel, at the home of her father's business partner, at the small house where her former schoolteacher lived. News traveled fast in Colfax, and by the time the sun began its descent toward the western hills, everyone knew that Edwin Walsh had thrown his eldest daughter out, and everyone assumed there must be good reason for such drastic action. In the unforgiving social landscape of a frontier town, a woman's reputation was everything, and once it was questioned, doors that had been open slammed shut with decisive finality. Theresa found herself walking toward the edge of town, as twilight painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Her feet ached, her throat was dry with dust and unshed tears, and the weight of her situation pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. She had a few coins in her pocket, enough perhaps for a meal, but certainly not enough for lodging, even if anyone would rent her a room. The night air in the foothills could turn cold quickly, even in spring, and she had no blanket, no shelter, no plan beyond surviving until morning, and hoping that somehow her father would come to his senses. She was sitting on a wooden crate behind the livery stable, trying to decide if she dared to sleep in the hayloft and risk being discovered and run off, when she heard the sound of boots on packed earth and looked up to see a man approaching. He was tall and lean, with broad shoulders and a weathered face that suggested he spent most of his time outdoors. His hat was pushed back on his head, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and his eyes were a striking blue-gray that seemed to take in everything about her situation in a single glance. "You look like you could use some help," he said, his voice low and steady. There was no judgment in his tone, no suspicion or accusation, just a simple statement of fact. Theresa bristled instinctively, too proud and too frightened to accept charity from a stranger. "I am fine, thank you, just resting before I head home." The man tilted his head slightly, and she saw the corner of his mouth quirk in what might have been sympathy or amusement. "That so? Because Sam at the livery told me there was a young woman sitting out here looking like she had nowhere to go, and Sam does not usually take notice of things that do not concern him unless something seems wrong." She felt heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassment mixing with anger at her own helplessness. "My circumstances are my own concern, sir. I appreciate your interest, but I assure you I can manage." He was quiet for a moment, studying her with those disconcerting eyes. Then he crouched down so they were at eye level, his hands resting loosely on his knees. "Name is Preston Thorne," he said. "I run a ranch about 5 miles west of here, up in the hills where the grassland starts. I came into town for supplies and heard some talk about Edwin Walsh and his daughter. I am guessing that would be you." Theresa looked away, blinking hard against the tears that threatened to spill over. "Then you know why no one will help me. You know what they are saying." "I know what they are saying," Preston agreed. "I also know that this town loves gossip more than truth, and I know Edwin Walsh is a hard man who has gotten harder since his wife passed. What I do not know is where you plan to sleep tonight, but I can tell you right now that sleeping rough in this town is not safe for anyone, let alone a woman on her own." "What choice do I have?" The words burst out of her before she could stop them, all her fear and frustration spilling over. "No one will take me in. I have no money for passage anywhere else. My father has made it clear I am not welcome at home. So please tell me what you suggest, because I have been trying to figure that out all day and I have come up with nothing." Preston stood up slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I suggest you come back to my ranch. I have a housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, who could use some help with the cooking and cleaning. The pay is not much, but it includes room and board, and you would be safe there. No one bothers my people, and I make sure everyone has a decent place to sleep and 3 meals a day." Theresa stared at him, trying to read his intentions. She had heard stories about men who preyed on desperate women, who made promises of work and safety only to demand terrible prices once the woman was isolated and vulnerable. But there was something in Preston Thorne's face, in the straightforward way he met her eyes, that spoke of sincerity rather than manipulation. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked. "You do not even know me." "True enough," he said, "but I know what it is like to need help and not have anywhere to turn. When I was younger, not much more than a boy really, I found myself in a bad situation down in Sacramento. Man named Daniel Wright gave me work when no one else would, taught me about ranching, treated me like I was worth something. He told me that if I ever had the means, I should pay that kindness forward. So, that is what I am doing. You need help? I can provide it. Simple as that." She wanted to believe him. More than that, she needed to believe him, because the alternative was spending the night huddled behind a livery stable, hoping no one discovered her, hoping the cold did not sink too deep into her bones, hoping that tomorrow would somehow be better than today. And when she looked into Preston Thorne's eyes, she saw no deceit there, only a quiet determination and something that looked like genuine concern. "All right," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I will come to your ranch. But I insist on earning my keep. I am a hard worker, and I will not be a burden." Preston nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face that transformed his serious features into something warm and approachable. "I would not expect anything less. Come on, my wagon is over at the general store. We can head out now and get you settled in before full dark." The ride up into the foothills was quiet at first. Theresa sat on the wagon seat beside Preston, acutely aware of the space between them, the way he handled the reins with casual competence, the strength in his hands and forearms. The road climbed steadily away from Colfax, leaving behind the noise and bustle of the mining town for the gentler sounds of evening birds and wind through the tall grass that covered the hillsides. The air smelled of wild sage and sun-warmed earth, and despite everything that had happened that day, Theresa felt some of the tension begin to ease from her shoulders. "How long have you had your ranch?" she asked, partly to break the silence and partly because she was curious about this man who had offered help when everyone else had turned her away. "Going on 6 years now," Preston said. "Started with just 100 acres and 20 head of cattle. Built it up slow and steady. Now I have got about 300 acres, decent herd, couple of good horses. Not the biggest operation around, but it is mine, and it supports the people who work for it." "Mrs. Chen, you mentioned her. Is she the only other person there?" "Right now, yes. I had a couple of ranch hands, but they moved on last month to try their luck in the mining camps. Young men, always looking for the next big strike. Cannot say I blame them, but it left me short-handed. Mrs. Chen is getting up in years, and the work has been too much for her lately. Your timing, if you can call it that, is actually good for all of us." Theresa absorbed this information, feeling marginally better about the arrangement. If there was another woman at the ranch, an older woman who could serve as a chaperone of sorts, then perhaps her reputation would not be completely destroyed by this move. Not that her reputation was in particularly good shape at the moment anyway. "What happened to your wife?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question when she saw Preston's jaw tighten. "I am sorry, I should not have asked. It is none of my business." "No, it is all right," he said after a moment. "You should know about the people you will be living with. I am not married, never have been. Came close once, back when I was working for Daniel Wright. Girl named Sarah Monroe, pretty as a picture and sweet-natured. But her father did not think a ranch hand with no prospects was good enough for his daughter. Married her off to a banker from San Francisco instead. Heard she is happy enough, has 3 children now. That was a long time ago." There was old pain in his voice, but it was the pain of a wound long since healed, leaving only a faint scar behind. Theresa understood that kind of hurt. The ache of knowing that circumstances beyond your control had shaped your life in ways you would not have chosen. "I am sorry," she said again, meaning it this time. Preston shrugged. "Things work out the way they are supposed to. If Sarah and I had married, I probably never would have left Sacramento, never would have come up here and started my own place. So, maybe it was for the best." They fell into a companionable silence after that, and Theresa watched as the landscape changed around them. The hills rose higher, covered in golden grass that rippled like water in the breeze. Oak trees dotted the slopes, their gnarled branches spreading wide to provide islands of shade. In the distance, she could see the darker line of pine forests climbing toward the Sierra Nevada peaks, still capped with snow, despite the advancing spring. When they finally topped a rise and Preston pointed down into a small valley, Theresa felt her breath catch. The ranch house sat nestled against the hillside, a sturdy structure of wood and stone with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Behind it stood a barn, a small bunkhouse, and several other outbuildings she could not identify in the fading light. A stream ran through the property, lined with willows that were just beginning to leaf out, and the meadow was dotted with cattle grazing peacefully in the dusk. "It is beautiful," she said, surprised by how much she meant it. "It is home," Preston replied simply, but she could hear the pride in his voice. As they pulled up to the house, the front door opened and a small, elderly Chinese woman emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face was weathered and kind, her dark eyes sharp as they took in Theresa's presence. "Mrs. Chen, this is Theresa Walsh," Preston said, as he helped Theresa down from the wagon. "She is going to be helping you around the house. Theresa, this is Mrs. Chen. She has been keeping this place running smoothly for the past 4 years, and I would be lost without her." Mrs. Chen looked Theresa up and down, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded once, decisively. "You look tired and hungry. Come inside. I will make tea and find you something to eat. Then we show you where you sleep." The warmth and efficiency with which Mrs. Chen took charge of the situation made Theresa want to cry with relief. She followed the older woman into the house, taking in the clean, spare interior with its practical furniture and well-scrubbed floors. The main room served as both kitchen and living space, with a large stone fireplace at one end and a sturdy table with 6 chairs near the cast-iron stove. Doors led off to what she assumed were bedrooms, and a ladder in the corner accessed what must be a loft space above. Mrs. Chen bustled about, putting a kettle on to boil and pulling out bread, cold meat, and cheese from the larder. Preston carried in Theresa's bag and set it by one of the doors. "That will be your room," he said, gesturing to the door. "It is small, but it has a window and a decent bed. Anything you need, you just ask Mrs. Chen or me. We eat breakfast at sunrise, dinner at midday, and supper a few hours before dark. Sundays we rest, go into town for church if the weather is good. During the week, there is always plenty to work to do, but we do not work anyone to death around here." Theresa nodded, overwhelmed by how quickly her circumstances had changed. Just hours ago she had been homeless and desperate, and now she was standing in a warm kitchen, with food being prepared for her, and a room of her own waiting. It seemed too good to be true, and some part of her kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Preston to reveal some hidden expectation or demand. But as the evening wore on and they sat around the table eating the simple meal Mrs. Chen had prepared, Theresa began to relax. Preston talked easily about the ranch, about the work that needed doing, about his plans to expand the herd if the summer went well. Mrs. Chen added her own observations in her slightly accented English, clearly comfortable enough with Preston to offer opinions and even gentle teasing about his tendency to take on too many projects at once. It was, Theresa realized, the first time in a long time that she had sat at a table and felt like she was among friends rather than walking on eggshells around her father's unpredictable moods. The realization brought a lump to her throat, and she had to blink rapidly to keep from crying. Preston must have noticed because his expression softened. "It has been a long day for you," he said gently. "Why don't you get some rest? Tomorrow will come early enough." Theresa nodded gratefully and excused herself. Her room was indeed small, barely large enough for the narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small table with a basin and pitcher for washing. But it was clean and private, and when she lay down on the bed and pulled the quilt up over herself, she felt safer than she had since her mother died. She woke to the sound of roosters crowing and early morning light streaming through the small window. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was, and then the events of the previous day came flooding back. She dressed quickly in one of her 2 dresses, splashed cold water on her face from the pitcher, and ventured out into the main room. Mrs. Chen was already up, working at the stove, and the smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air. "Good morning," the older woman said. "You sleep well?" "Very well, thank you," Theresa replied. "What can I do to help?" "Mrs." Chen pointed to a basket of eggs. "You can scramble those. Preston will be in soon from checking the animals. He always checks them first thing, makes sure everything is all right from the night." Theresa set to work, and by the time Preston came through the door, stamping dust from his boots, she had a pan of fluffy scrambled eggs ready to go with the bacon and biscuits Mrs. Chen had prepared. They ate together, and Preston outlined the day's work. "I need to ride out and check the fence line on the eastern boundary," he said. "Had some trouble with coyotes last month. Want to make sure they have not found a way through. Mrs. Chen, if you could show Theresa the routine around the house, that would be good. No need to throw her into the deep end on her first day." The morning passed in a blur of activity. Mrs. Chen showed Theresa how she liked things done, where supplies were kept, what needed to be cleaned, and when. The older woman was patient but exacting, and Theresa found herself working harder than she had in years. Her father's house had been comfortable but small, and with her younger sisters to help, the work had never been overwhelming. Here, there was simply more of everything. More space to clean, more cooking to do for 3 people, instead of the quick meals she had been making for just herself and her father after her sisters went to bed. But the work felt good. It kept her hands busy and her mind occupied, leaving little room to dwell on her father's rejection or worry about what would become of her. Mrs. Chen proved to be a gentle teacher, offering corrections without criticism and praise when Theresa did something well. By the time midday dinner rolled around, Theresa was sweaty and tired, but also oddly satisfied. They had prepared a hearty stew with vegetables from Mrs. Chen's garden, and Preston came in dusty and hungry, clearly pleased with the meal set before him. "Fence is holding well," he reported as he ate. "Saw a few deer up in the high meadow, and the cattle all look healthy. Should be a good year if the weather holds." "You always say that," Mrs. Chen said with a small smile. "Every year you say it should be good if weather holds, and every year something happens. Last year was the drought, year before was the early snow." Preston laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "Well, what can I say? I am an optimist. Got to be in this business." Watching them interact, Theresa felt a pang of longing. This was what a home should feel like, she thought. Not the tense silence of her father's house, where everyone tiptoed around Edwin Walsh's moods, but this easy camaraderie between people who worked together and respected each other. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Theresa rose early, helped prepare meals, cleaned, learned to make cheese and butter from Mrs. Chen tended the vegetable garden and fell into bed each night pleasantly exhausted. Preston was a constant presence, always working on some project or another, fixing fences, training a young horse, moving the cattle to better grazing. He was quiet by nature, but not cold, and Theresa found herself looking forward to meal times when they would all sit together and Preston would share stories about his day or ask about theirs. She learned that he was 27 years old, that he had grown up in a Sacramento orphanage until he was 12 and then worked at various odd jobs until Daniel Wright had taken him on. She learned that he loved this land with a fierce passion, that he could read the weather in the clouds and the behavior of the animals, that he was scrupulously fair in all his dealings and expected the same from others. And slowly, without quite meaning to, she began to notice other things about him, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the strength in his hands as he mended a harness or repaired a broken chair, the patience he showed with a skittish horse or a stubborn cow, the way he always made sure Mrs. Chen was not working too hard, often taking on tasks himself rather than asking the elderly woman to do them. It had been 3 weeks since Theresa arrived at the ranch when Preston announced at breakfast that he needed to go into Colfax for supplies and to conduct some business at the bank. "Anyone need anything from town?" he asked. Mrs. Chen shook her head, but Theresa felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. She had not been back to Colfax since that terrible day when her father cast her out. The thought of returning, of potentially seeing her father or any of the people who had refused to help her, filled her with dread. "You should go with him," Mrs. Chen said, looking directly at Theresa. "You cannot hide here forever. Better to face town now, show them you are doing well." Theresa wanted to protest, but she knew Mrs. Chen was right. She could not avoid Colfax indefinitely, and putting it off would only make it harder. "All right," she said quietly. "I will come." The ride into town was tense. Preston seemed to sense her anxiety because he kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out landmarks, talking about the history of the area, clearly trying to keep her mind occupied. But as they rolled into Colfax's main street, Theresa felt her heart begin to pound. Preston pulled the wagon up in front of the general store and helped her down. "I will be at the bank for a while," he said. "Why don't you pick up whatever supplies you think we need? Mrs. Chen gave me a list, but you might see things she did not think of. Take your time, and I will meet you back here in about an hour." Theresa nodded and made herself walk into the store with her head held high. The proprietor, Mr. Jameson, looked up as she entered and his eyebrows rose in surprise. "Miss Walsh," he said carefully, "I heard you had left town." "I am working at Preston Thorne's ranch now," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "I need some supplies." She could feel his eyes on her as she moved through the store, consulting Mrs. Chen's list and selecting items. When she brought everything to the counter, Mr. Jameson tallied it up in silence. As he wrapped the purchases, he cleared his throat. "Your father has been in a few times," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "He looks terrible, Miss Walsh. I think he regrets what he did, though he is too proud to say so." Theresa felt a complicated mix of emotions sweep through her, anger and hurt, and a stubborn remnant of love for the man who had raised her, however imperfectly. "That is his burden to bear," she said quietly. "He made his choice." Mr. Jameson nodded slowly. "That he did. For what it is worth, I think most folks in town have realized there was nothing to those rumors. The woman who started them, Mrs. Patterson, she has been caught in several other lies since then. People do not trust her word anymore." "That is good to know," Theresa said, though the vindication felt hollow. Where had these people been when she needed them, when she was desperate and alone? She was loading the supplies into the wagon when she heard her name called. Turning, she saw her father walking toward her, and her whole body tensed. Edwin Walsh looked older than she remembered, his face more lined, his shoulders slightly stooped. He stopped a few feet away, his hat in his hands, his expression uncertain. "Theresa," he said, his voice rough, "I heard you were working out at the Thorne place." "Yes," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "I am." He shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable. "Your sisters miss you. The house is not the same without you." "You should have thought of that before you locked me out," Theresa said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "You chose to believe gossip over your own daughter. You cast me out with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. I could have died, Father. Did you think of that?" Edwin flinched as if she had struck him. "I was angry. I thought you had shamed me, shamed the family name. Mrs. Patterson was very convincing. And now you know she is a liar, but that does not undo what you did. You taught me that actions have consequences, Father. These are yours." "I am sorry, Theresa. Truly I am. Come home. I will tell everyone I was wrong, that I made a terrible mistake. We can put this behind us." For a moment, just a moment, Theresa was tempted. The pull of family, of the familiar, was strong. But then she thought of the ranch, of Mrs. Chen's patient kindness, of Preston's steady reliability. She thought of how she had felt that first night, standing on her father's porch begging to be let in, and how he had turned his back on her. "No," she said firmly. "I have a home now, a place where people trust me and value me. You made it clear I am not your daughter anymore. You do not get to change your mind now just because you are lonely or because the town has stopped believing Mrs. Patterson's lies." Edwin's face crumpled. "Please, Theresa. You are my eldest girl. I need you. You should have thought of that before." She turned away from him and busied herself with the supplies, her hands shaking but her resolve firm. She heard her father stand there for a moment longer, then heard his footsteps retreating. Only when he was gone did she allow herself to lean against the wagon, breathing hard, tears streaming down her face. That was how Preston found her a few minutes later. He took one look at her face and seemed to understand immediately. Without a word, he helped her up onto the wagon seat, climbed up beside her, and guided the horses out of town. They were a mile outside Colfax when he finally spoke. "You saw your father." It was not a question, but Theresa answered anyway. "Yes," he apologized. "He asked me to come home." "And you said no." "I said no." She looked over at him, wondering what he thought, whether he judged her for refusing her father's apology. Was that wrong? Preston was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the road ahead. "I think you did what you needed to do. Your father hurt you badly, Theresa. An apology does not erase that, does not make it safe for you to go back to a situation where someone could turn on you like that again. You deserve better than being at the mercy of someone else's temper and pride." His words opened something in her chest, some tight knot of guilt and doubt she had not even realized she was carrying. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For understanding, for taking me in when I had nowhere else to go, for making sure I never had to sleep outside, never had to be afraid or desperate again. You saved me, Preston. I do not know how to repay that." Preston's hands tightened on the reins, and when he looked at her, there was something new in his eyes, something warm and intense that made her breath catch. "You do not owe me anything, Theresa. Having you at the ranch, it has been good. For all of us, but especially for me. You make the place feel more like a real home instead of just somewhere I work and sleep." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Theresa felt heat rise to her cheeks, felt her heart begin to beat faster. Over the past 3 weeks, she had been trying not to think about Preston as anything other than her employer, had been carefully keeping her growing feelings locked away. But now, hearing the note in his voice, seeing the way he was looking at her, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he felt something too. They did not speak of it again that day, but something had shifted between them. Theresa noticed the way Preston's gaze would linger on her when he thought she was not looking. She caught herself finding excuses to be wherever he was working, to bring him water or ask questions about the ranch. Mrs. Chen noticed too, if the knowing looks she gave them were any indication. But the older woman said nothing, just smiled to herself as she kneaded bread or stirred soup. It was mid-May when the spring roundup began. Preston needed to gather all his cattle from where they had scattered across his property during the winter and early spring, brand the new calves, and assess the health of the herd. It was hard, demanding work, and he hired 2 temporary hands from town to help, young men named Tom and James who slept in the bunkhouse and ate their meals at the main house. Theresa found herself working harder than ever, preparing large quantities of food for 5 people instead of 3, packing lunches for the men to take out on the range, washing dusty, sweaty clothes every night. But she did not mind. There was an energy to the place during roundup, a sense of purpose and accomplishment, and she loved seeing Preston in his element, handling the cattle with casual expertise, working from dawn until well past dusk. One evening, after a particularly long day, Preston came in so tired he could barely stand. Tom and James had already eaten and retreated to the bunkhouse, and Mrs. Chen had gone to bed early, leaving Theresa alone in the kitchen. She had kept a plate of food warm for Preston, and she set it in front of him as he sank into a chair. "You are going to work yourself to death," she said gently, pouring him a cup of coffee. "Just a few more days," he said, picking up his fork. "We are almost done. The herd looks good this year, Theresa. Really good. If I can get a decent price for the cattle I need to sell, I might be able to buy that additional land to the north that I have been eyeing." His enthusiasm was contagious, and Theresa found herself smiling. That would be wonderful. They talked easily as he ate, discussing plans for the ranch, the garden Mrs. Chen wanted to expand, whether they should get some chickens to supplement the eggs they bought in town. It was comfortable and domestic, and Theresa realized with a start that this was what she wanted. Not just a safe place to live, not just work to keep her busy, but this partnership and companionship, this sense of building something together. Preston must have seen something in her expression because he set down his fork and reached across the table to take her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, his grip strong and warm. "Theresa," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." Her heart began to pound. "What is it?" "When I brought you here, it was because you needed help and I could provide it. That was all it was supposed to be. But somewhere along the way, things changed. You changed them, just by being yourself, by working hard and fitting in here, like you were always meant to be part of this place. And I find myself thinking about you all the time, wondering what you're doing, looking forward to meals just so I can sit across from you and talk. I am not good with words, never have been, but what I am trying to say is that I care about you. A lot. More than I should, maybe, considering you work for me, and you have already been through so much." Theresa felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were good tears this time, tears of relief and joy. "You are not the only one," she said softly. "I tried not to let myself feel anything, tried to just be grateful for the work and the safety. But I failed at that, Preston. I care about you too. So much it scares me sometimes." Preston's face transformed with a smile that was pure happiness. He stood up, still holding her hand, and drew her to her feet. For a moment, they just stood there, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the flecks of green in his blue-gray eyes. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," she breathed, and then his lips were on hers, gentle at first, and then deeper, more certain. She melted into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the solid beat of his heart beneath her palms. The kiss was everything she had dreamed of in the secret hours of the night when she allowed herself to imagine this moment, sweet and passionate and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he said. "I want to court you properly, the way you deserve. I know your father cast you out and you might not care about his opinion anymore, but I still want to do things the right way. I will come into town with you, and we will tell people we are courting, and anyone who has a problem with it can answer to me." Theresa laughed, the sound bubbling up from deep inside her. "I think Mrs. Chen already knows." "Mrs. Chen knows everything," Preston agreed with a grin. "But yes, I suspect she has been waiting for us to figure this out for weeks now." They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other, until the candles burned low and the night outside grew deep and still. Finally, reluctantly, they separated, both knowing that Mrs. Chen would not approve of anything improper under her roof, both wanting to honor the older woman's sensibilities. "Tomorrow," Preston said, brushing a strand of hair back from Theresa's face, "tomorrow I will tell Tom and James, and when they go back to town after the roundup is done, everyone will know. If your father hears about it and comes out here, I will talk to him, tell him my intentions are honorable." "My father gave up any right to have a say in my life," Theresa replied. "But I appreciate that you want to do things properly. It matters to me." The next few days passed in a blur of hard work and stolen moments. Preston made his announcement to Tom and James at breakfast, and both young men grinned and offered their congratulations. Mrs. Chen simply nodded, as if this was exactly what she had expected, though Theresa caught her smiling to herself more than once. When the roundup was finally complete and Tom and James had been paid and sent back to town, the ranch settled into a new kind of rhythm. Preston now felt free to show his affection openly, catching Theresa's hand as they walked to the barn, stealing kisses when Mrs. Chen was occupied elsewhere, sitting close to her at meals. They talked for hours in the evenings, sharing their histories, their hopes, their dreams for the future. Theresa learned that Preston wanted children someday, wanted to build something that would last beyond his own lifetime. She told him about her mother, about the happy years before her death, when the Walsh household had been full of love and laughter. They discovered shared passions for music, though neither of them could carry a tune, and a love of thunderstorms that rolled down from the mountains on summer afternoons. It was during one such storm in late June that Preston brought up the subject of marriage. They were sitting on the porch, watching lightning fork across the sky and rain pour down in silvery sheets, and he reached over and took her hand. "I have been thinking," he said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I know we have not been courting long, not in the traditional sense, but I feel like I have known you much longer than a few months. Like, you have always been part of my life, and I just had to wait for you to actually arrive." Theresa turned to look at him, her heart in her throat. "I feel the same way." "Then I am going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully about it before you answer, because once you say yes, I am going to hold you to it." He shifted to face her fully, his expression serious. "Theresa Walsh, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The tears came again, and she did not bother to wipe them away. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, Preston, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she felt his chest heave with emotion. When he finally loosened his grip enough for her to look up at him, his own eyes were suspiciously bright. "I do not have a ring yet," he said. "I will go into Sacramento next week, find something worthy of you." "I do not need a fancy ring," Theresa protested. "I just need you." "Well, you are getting both," Preston said firmly. "My wife is going to have a proper ring and a proper wedding and everything else she deserves." Mrs. Chen was delighted by the news and immediately began planning the wedding with the efficiency she brought to all her tasks. They decided on August for the ceremony, giving them time to prepare and to spread the word. Preston made a trip to Sacramento, returning with a simple gold band set with a small but beautiful sapphire. "It reminded me of the sky over the ranch at dusk," he said as he slipped it onto her finger, "when everything is peaceful and perfect." Theresa loved it more than she could say, not for its monetary value, but for what it represented, the thought and care Preston had taken to choose something meaningful. As summer deepened and the wedding approached, they made a trip into Colfax to formally announce their engagement and to invite the townspeople to the ceremony. Theresa was nervous about facing the town again, but Preston's steady presence at her side gave her courage. They stopped first at the church to speak with Reverend Matthews, who was pleased to agree to perform the ceremony. Then they went to the general store to place an announcement in the window and to order supplies for the wedding celebration. It was as they were leaving the store that Theresa's father appeared. He looked even worse than he had the last time she saw him, his clothes hanging loose on his frame, his face haggard. But when he saw Preston standing beside Theresa, saw the ring on her finger, understanding dawned in his eyes. "So it is true," Edwin said heavily. "You are marrying him." "Yes," Theresa replied, lifting her chin. "We are to be married in August." Edwin looked at Preston with an expression that was equal parts resentment and grudging respect. "You will take care of her?" "With my life," Preston said quietly but firmly. "She will never want for anything, and she will never be cast out or made to feel less than the treasure she is." The words were a rebuke, gentle but unmistakable, and Edwin flinched. He turned back to Theresa, and she saw tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. "I have been a fool, a proud, stubborn fool. Your mother would be ashamed of me." "Yes," Theresa agreed softly. "She would be." "Will you let me come to the wedding? Let me walk you down the aisle, give you away properly? I know I have no right to ask, but you are still my daughter, Theresa. You always will be." Theresa looked up at Preston, who squeezed her hand but remained silent, leaving the decision to her. She took a deep breath, searching her heart for what felt right. Her father had hurt her terribly, and she would carry those scars for a long time, but he was still her father, and despite everything, she still loved him. And perhaps more importantly, her younger sisters should not have to choose between their father and their sister, should not have to miss their eldest sister's wedding because of Edwin Walsh's pride. "You may come," she said finally, "but I will not have you walk me down the aisle. That right? You forfeited when you locked me out of your house. Preston will stand with me as my equal, not as someone receiving me from another man's keeping." It was unorthodox, even scandalous, but Theresa did not care. She had already broken with convention by surviving alone, by working on a ranch, by courting a man without her father's permission. What was one more breach of etiquette compared to living her life on her own terms? Edwin nodded slowly, accepting this condition. "I understand. Thank you for letting me be there. And Theresa, I truly am sorry for what it is worth." "It is worth something," Theresa allowed. "But it does not erase what happened. You will have to live with that, as I have had to." They left him standing there on the dusty street and made their way back to the wagon. As they drove out of town, Preston glanced over at her. "Are you all right?" "I think so," Theresa said. "It felt good to speak my mind, to tell him exactly what I thought. And I do want my sisters at the wedding. They wrote to me last month, you know. Sent the letter care of Mrs. Chen. They told me how much they miss me, how angry they are at Father for what he did. I wrote back and told them about you, about the ranch. They are excited to see it. They are welcome anytime," Preston said. "This will be your home, Theresa, which means your family is welcome here. Even your father, if you decide that is what you want." "I do not know what I want where he is concerned," Theresa admitted. "But I know I do not want anger and bitterness to poison what we have, so I will be civil to him, and perhaps someday I can forgive him fully. But that day is not today." Preston nodded, understanding written clear on his face. It was one of the things she loved about him, his ability to let her feel what she felt without trying to fix it or change it, his willingness to simply be present and supportive. The weeks leading up to the wedding flew by in a whirlwind of preparations. Mrs. Chen sewed Theresa a beautiful dress of cream-colored silk that Preston had brought back from Sacramento, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. They cleaned the ranch house from top to bottom, prepared food for the celebration that would follow the ceremony, and arranged for long tables to be set up in the yard for the guests. Theresa's sisters came to visit a week before the wedding, and their reunion was tearful and joyful. Martha was 16 now, Catherine 14, and both of them had grown taller and more mature in the months since Theresa had left home. They peppered her with questions about the ranch, about Preston, about her new life, and Theresa answered all of them honestly, wanting them to understand that she was happy, that leaving had ultimately been a blessing in disguise. "He is very handsome," Martha whispered when Preston was out of earshot. "And the way he looks at you, Theresa, like you hung the moon. You are so lucky." "I am," Theresa agreed, watching Preston through the window as he worked with one of the horses. "But it is more than luck. It is finding someone who sees you for who you really are and loves you anyway. Someone who will stand by you when times are hard." "Father has been drinking more since you left," Catherine said quietly. "He sits in his chair at night and just stares into the fire. We try to talk to him, but he does not really hear us. It is like he is somewhere else." Theresa felt a pang of sadness for the man her father had become, but she pushed it away. She could not take responsibility for his choices, could not sacrifice her own happiness to ease his guilt. "He made his decision," she said gently. "Now he has to live with it. You girls do not have to carry that burden." The day of the wedding dawned bright and clear, with a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Theresa woke early, her stomach fluttering with a mixture of excitement and nerves. Mrs. Chen helped her into her dress, then stood back with tears in her eyes. "You look beautiful," the older woman said. "Preston is a very lucky man." "I think I am the lucky one," Theresa replied, but Mrs. Chen shook her head. "You are both lucky. You found each other when you needed most. That is what makes it special." The ceremony was held in the yard beneath the ancient oak tree that stood on the north side of the property. Reverend Matthews presided, his voice carrying clearly in the still summer air. Preston stood tall and handsome in his best suit, his eyes never leaving Theresa's face as she walked across the grass to join him. True to her word, she walked alone, needing no one to give her away because she was giving herself freely, choosing this man and this life with her whole heart. Her father was there, standing at the back of the gathered crowd with her sisters, his face a mask of sorrow and regret. But Theresa did not look at him for long. Her focus was on Preston, on the love and commitment shining in his eyes, on the future they were about to begin together. "Do you, Preston Thorne, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Preston said, his voice strong and sure. "And do you, Theresa Walsh, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Theresa replied, her voice equally firm despite the tears streaming down her face. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Preston gathered her into his arms and kissed her deeply, and the assembled guests erupted in applause and cheers. Theresa clung to him, feeling like her heart might burst with happiness. This man, this wonderful, steadfast man, was her husband now. They belonged to each other, and nothing would ever separate them. The celebration that followed was joyous and raucous. Tables groaned under the weight of food that Mrs. Chen and several town women had prepared. There was music and dancing, and even Edwin Walsh managed to crack a smile as he watched his daughter whirl around the yard in her husband's arms. Martha and Catherine took turns dancing with the young ranch hands Tom and James, who had been invited back for the occasion, and Mrs. Chen accepted compliments on her cooking with characteristic modesty. As evening fell and lanterns were lit around the yard, Preston pulled Theresa aside, leading her away from the party and down to the stream that ran through the property. They stood together in the gathering dusk, the sound of water over stones mingling with the distant laughter and music from the celebration. "Happy?" Preston asked, slipping his arms around her waist from behind. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Theresa replied, leaning back against his chest. "When my father locked me out, I thought my life was over. I thought I would die alone and forgotten. But instead, I found you. I found home." "We found each other," Preston corrected gently. "And we are going to build something amazing here, Theresa. A real ranch, a real family. The kind of place where people feel safe and valued, where our children will grow up knowing they are loved unconditionally." "Children," Theresa repeated, turning in his arms to face him. "How many children are you envisioning, Mr. Thorne?" He grinned, that rare, full smile that transformed his face. "As many as you will give me, Mrs. Thorne. A whole houseful, maybe. I want to fill these hills with the sound of children laughing." "That sounds perfect," Theresa said, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "Everything about this, about you, is perfect." They kissed again as the stars began to emerge overhead, and Theresa thought about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been cast out, rejected by her own father, turned away by everyone she thought she could count on. But in that moment of deepest despair, when she had nowhere to go and no one to turn to, Preston Thorne had appeared and offered her not just shelter, but a new life, a fresh start, a chance to become more than she had ever dreamed possible. The party continued late into the night, but eventually the guests began to drift away. Tom and James helped clear up, then headed back to the bunkhouse. Martha and Catherine had already gone home with their father, extracting promises from Theresa to visit soon and to let them come stay at the ranch during the summer. Mrs. Chen retired to her room with a satisfied smile, leaving Preston and Theresa alone at last. Preston lifted Theresa in his arms, making her laugh, as he carried her across the threshold of what was now their shared bedroom. He set her down gently, and they stood facing each other, suddenly shy despite all the months of courtship, despite the depth of feeling between them. "I love you," Preston said simply. "I know I do not say it enough, but I do, more than I can ever put into words." "I love you too," Theresa replied, "and we have the rest of our lives to show each other just how much." The months that followed their wedding were some of the happiest of Theresa's life. She and Preston settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both, working side by side during the day and falling into bed exhausted but content each night. The ranch prospered under their combined care, and Preston was able to purchase the additional land he had been wanting, expanding their grazing territory and their herd. Mrs. Chen remained with them, more friend than employee now, though she still insisted on handling most of the cooking. Theresa took over the majority of the housework and helped with the outdoor tasks when needed, learning to ride and rope alongside Preston, becoming as much a rancher as he was. Her father came to visit occasionally, awkward and tentative, clearly trying to rebuild the bridge he had burned. Theresa accepted these visits with cautious grace, not quite ready to fully forgive, but willing to keep the door open. Her sisters came more frequently, delighting in the freedom of the ranch and in watching the obvious love between Theresa and Preston. It was in November, as the first snows began to dust the higher peaks, that Theresa realized she was pregnant. She told Preston one evening, as they sat by the fire, Mrs. Chen having already gone to bed. He stared at her for a moment, as if he could not quite process her words, and then a grin spread across his face that was pure joy. "A baby," he said, his voice awed. "We are going to have a baby?" "In the spring," Theresa confirmed, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "Around May, the doctor thinks." Preston pulled her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with happy tears. "This is the best news," he murmured against her hair. "The absolute best news. We are going to be a family, Theresa. A real family." "We already are a family," she pointed out, but she knew what he meant. A child would be the culmination of everything they had built together, living proof of the love they shared. The pregnancy was not easy. Theresa suffered from terrible morning sickness in the early months, and Preston fretted over her constantly, much to her amusement and occasional frustration. Mrs. Chen took over more of the work again, insisting that Theresa rest and take care of herself and the baby. As winter deepened and travel became difficult, they hunkered down on the ranch, a small but contented unit weathering the storms together. By the time spring arrived, Theresa was enormous and uncomfortable, eager to meet the child she had been carrying for what felt like forever. Preston had transformed one of the small storage rooms into a nursery, building a cradle with his own hands and painting the walls a cheerful yellow. Mrs. Chen had sewn tiny clothes and blankets, and Theresa's sisters had contributed a beautiful quilt they had worked on together. The baby came on a warm May evening, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world. Preston, who had been pacing outside while Mrs. Chen and the midwife attended to Theresa, burst into the room the moment he was allowed and stared down at his son with an expression of wonder. "He is perfect," he breathed, carefully taking the tiny bundle from Theresa's arms. "Absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" They had discussed names for months, but never quite settled on one. Now, looking at her son's small face, at the way Preston cradled him with such reverence, Theresa knew exactly what felt right. "Daniel," she said. "After Daniel Wright, the man who helped you when you needed it most. Daniel Preston Thorne." Preston looked up at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Daniel," he repeated. "I think he would have been honored. Thank you, Theresa, for him, for everything. You have given me more than I ever dreamed of having." "We gave it to each other," Theresa corrected gently. "That is how this works." Life with a newborn was chaotic and exhausting, but also filled with moments of such sweetness that Theresa could hardly stand it. Watching Preston with their son, seeing the big, strong rancher reduced to a puddle of mush by a toothless baby's smile, filled her with a contentment so profound it was almost painful. Mrs. Chen doted on little Daniel, singing to him in Chinese and rocking him when he fussed, becoming the grandmother he would have otherwise lacked. Even Edwin Walsh softened when he met his first grandson. He came to visit when Daniel was 2 months old and held the baby with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face. "He looks like your mother," he told Theresa, his voice breaking. Around the eyes, she would have loved him so much. "Yes," Theresa agreed quietly. She would have. It was not a full reconciliation, not quite, but it was a step forward. Over time, as Daniel grew and Edwin continued to visit, the wounds between father and daughter began to slowly heal. Theresa never forgot what he had done, how he had cast her out when she most needed him. But she chose to forgive, to let go of the bitterness for her own sake and for her son's. Daniel was 2 years old when his brother arrived, born on a snowy December day. They named this one Samuel, after Preston's mentor's middle name, and he was as different from his brother as could be imagined. Where Daniel was serious and thoughtful, Samuel was all mischief and laughter from the moment he could focus his eyes. 2 years after that came their daughter, whom they named Rebecca after Theresa's mother. She had her mother's delicate features and her father's blue-gray eyes, and she wrapped both her parents and her brothers around her little finger from the start. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Preston hired more permanent hands as the herd expanded, built a bigger barn, improved the house with running water and other modern conveniences as they became available. But he never lost sight of what mattered most, never let the work consume him the way some ranchers did. He made time for his family, for evenings by the fire with Theresa after the children were in bed, for teaching his sons to ride and rope, for reading stories to Rebecca and braiding her hair with surprising deftness. Mrs. Chen eventually became too frail to work, and she transitioned into a beloved grandmother figure, spending her days in a rocking chair by the fire, watching the children play and offering advice when asked. She passed away peacefully in her sleep when Daniel was 10, and they buried her on the hillside overlooking the ranch, beneath a headstone that read, "Beloved friend and family." Theresa's father died 2 years later, succumbing to the pneumonia that had plagued him for years. To Teresa's surprise, she grieved deeply, mourning not just the man he had been at the end, but the father he had been when her mother was alive, when love had been freely given and the Walsh household had been happy. Preston held her as she cried and said nothing, understanding that some griefs needed no words, only presence. Martha and Catherine both married and settled in California, close enough to visit regularly. The cousins grew up together, spending summers running wild on the ranch, learning the rhythms of the land and the satisfaction of hard work. The bond between the sisters, broken by Edwin Walsh's pride and cruelty, was rebuilt stronger than ever, tempered by the trials they had weathered. As the years passed and the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Theresa would sometimes stand on the porch of the ranch house and marvel at the life she had built. The terrified young woman who had been locked out of her father's house, who had faced rejection from everyone she knew, seemed like a different person entirely. That girl had been broken and desperate, seeing no future beyond the next cold night on the streets. But that girl had also been strong enough to survive, to accept help when it was offered, to take a chance on a quiet rancher with kind eyes and a generous heart. And from that chance had grown this life, this beautiful, messy, wonderful life, full of love and laughter, and the kind of deep contentment that came from building something real and lasting. Preston came up behind her one such evening, slipping his arms around her waist as he had done so many times over their 20 years of marriage. Their children were grown now, Daniel preparing to take over the ranch, Samuel studying veterinary medicine in Sacramento, Rebecca engaged to a nice young man from town. "What are you thinking about?" Preston asked, resting his chin on top of her head. "About how you saved my life," Theresa said simply. "About how everything I have, everything I am, exists because you saw a frightened girl behind a livery stable and decided to help." "I think we saved each other," Preston replied. "I was existing before you came, Theresa, just going through the motions. You made me live again, made this place into a real home instead of just a piece of land I worked. So if there is any saving to be credited, it goes both ways." Theresa turned in his arms, looking up at the man she loved more with each passing year. His hair was gray now, his face more lined, but his eyes still held that same steadfast warmth that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "We are a good team," she said. "The best team," Preston agreed, and kissed her as the sun set over the hills they had called home for more than 2 decades. The years continued to unfold, bringing grandchildren and great-grandchildren, changes and challenges, joys and sorrows. But through it all, Theresa and Preston faced everything together, their bond unshakable, their love enduring. The ranch passed to Daniel and his wife, then to his children, becoming a legacy that stretched across generations. And on quiet evenings, when the family gathered for celebrations or holidays, someone would always tell the story of how it all began. How Theresa Walsh had been cast out by her father and could not get back inside, and how Preston Thorne had made sure she never slept outside again. How from that act of kindness had grown a love story for the ages, a partnership that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. It was a story of resilience and redemption, of second chances and the power of choosing love even in the darkest moments. It was the foundation upon which the Thorne family was built, and it would be told and retold for generations, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us exactly where we are meant to be. When Preston passed away at 82, surrounded by his family, Theresa held his hand and whispered all the things she had told him 1,000 times before, that he was her hero, her partner, her great love, that she would have chosen him in every lifetime, in every circumstance, that the scared girl he had found behind the livery stable could never have imagined the rich, full life they would share. She followed him 5 years later, slipping away peacefully in her sleep, in the same house where she had spent most of her adult life. They buried her next to Preston on the hillside, their headstones side by side, together even in death as they had been in life. The ranch continued, the family they had created carrying on their legacy. And though Theresa and Preston were gone, their love story remained, woven into the very fabric of the land they had worked, visible in the faces of their descendants, present in every act of kindness and every decision to choose compassion over judgment. Because in the end, that was what their story had been about. Not just romance, though there had been plenty of that. Not just survival, though that had been part of it too. But about the transformative power of seeing someone in their darkest moment and choosing to help, of building something beautiful from the ashes of rejection and loss, of believing that love and loyalty could overcome any obstacle. Theresa had been cast out, had faced a night when she had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. But Preston had made sure she never slept outside, and in doing so, he had given her not just shelter, but a home, not just safety, but a future, not just acceptance, but a love that would endure for all time. And that, their descendants would say when they told the story to their own children and grandchildren, was what real love looked like. Not the easy affection of people who had never faced hardship, but the fierce, enduring bond between two people who had found each other when they most needed to be found, and who had spent every day after that choosing each other, building together, loving with everything they had. It was a love story worthy of the Wild West, of that raw and beautiful time when the land was still being tamed and people were still figuring out how to build lives in an unforgiving landscape. A time when a single act of kindness could change everything, when love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, when two broken people could find each other and become whole. The ranch stood as their monument, but their true legacy was in the love they had shared and the family they had built. Every board in the house, every fence post on the property, every tree planted around the yard carried the echo of their devotion. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew down from the mountains, you could almost hear it, the whispered story of Theresa and Preston, the girl who had been cast out, and the cowboy who had made sure she was never left out in the cold again.